Go get whatever. Yeah, go do you. Take care of it. I'm already seeing some good posters back here. I have no idea what they're for. It's a little pixelated, but.
Oh yeah, so I like collect and archive old magazines and print ephemera from like the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the internet era.
Oh, nice.
So this is just like some of the blue stuff. So like this is some tickets from the 1962 Seattle World's Fair. This is like from the 64 fair, along with some stuff down here. This is like the first album of electronic music ever commercially produced, 1963 by Bell Labs. So like if you've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, the scene where Hal is singing at the end, that comes from this album, and that's the first ever electronically synthesized voice.
Right.
There's like a bunch of cool little history tchotchkes.
That's insane that you have that. That's a cool thing to have. This is definitely the exact kind of thing I was hoping we can get into for this.
Oh, absolutely.
Because all things related to game development, I'm totally excited to be talking about, but I find
I'm a big history freak. Like,
right.
It is really easy to set me off on a tangent that I can just like go on and on and on about. So if I get too far into that.
Oh no, I'm hoping for that. That is something that I'm betting on today. Ellis Tucci is here today, creator of Spectra, something that you've been working on for about like 3 years now.
Yeah, it actually started in March 2020, so I guess it'll be 3 years next month.
Right, that's wild. It's about the same for me. It's like I feel like we're on a very similar timeline as well.
Yeah, good time to start the project. Trapped inside for a while, you know.
Totally. You could just like I think some of the best things that I've heard from people have come from the pandemic, and it's just because you have so much time to just like, kind of be indulgent in certain ways, I feel like, and people just give themselves what's the phrase people use? They bet on themselves a little bit more during the pandemic.
You know, I graduated college in the class of 2020, and I had a job lined up. I was going to be a high school history teacher in rural Mississippi, and COVID just like completely eliminated that job. And so, I'm stuck back in my childhood home for quite a number of months with nothing really to do. Might as well make a video game, right?
Had you ever made games before this?
Well, I had been involved in stuff. Like I went to a computer camp when I was in grade school, and we like made stuff on Scratch when I was maybe 9 years old or something. Mm-hmm. I got this big fat CD-ROM off of eBay that was like the starter kit for Dark Basic, and it was like so ancient that it would only run on my dad's like ThinkPad work laptop that was like 2 inches thick. Right. And of course, like at 9 years old, you don't realize all the things that have to go into making something in Dark Basic, and so it was just like, nothing ever really came of that. But the love definitely stayed there, and it was something that I had wanted to do for a really, really long time.
If you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
I'm about to turn 25.
Right on.
Birthday's in early March.
It's kind of crazy to think that there's a lot of people who are growing up in a time where like, because I'm only a few years ahead of you, I think. Maybe that's me trying to like delude myself from how I'm getting older, but I like to think I'm not too much older than you. And growing up with the tools available to us right now, really changing, like you're saying, you grew up with something that was like kind of inaccessible, but now you're using blueprints, right? Like what's can you talk a little bit, because so far I haven't had any Unreal developers on here. If you could just talk a little bit about like maybe your experience of like the friction with getting into game development, especially in like with Blueprints and Unreal and stuff.
Unreal's got a really good visual scripting node-based programming language called Blueprints, and I would say that the most difficult part about like getting into that system is kind of understanding the limits and the capabilities of it. So, when you're dealing with a node-based system like that, I think that really everything that you can kind of write in that structure is relatively simple. Like, you can make wildly complex things with it, but your puzzle pieces can be relatively simple. And figuring out what fits in where and what can interact with what can be a decently steep learning curve. But thankfully, there are a really large amount of tutorials out there online for pretty much anything you could imagine in Unreal.
Was there ever like the urge in you to go more like as all in as you are right now earlier on, but like couldn't because of the tools?
I don't really think so, no. I think like all of the stuff that I did in the past, like for a number of years, I was really into doing environment mods for like Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 4. And I never really had the intention of like, man, I want to make something really grand in the creation kit or the GEC or whatever. But I think like when Spectra started out development, it started out a lot smaller. And it was initially like a little rural town that was kind of space age and retro futuristic, and it would the area of the town would open up as you progressed, and eventually, like, for a number of reasons, I decided that I didn't want to continue in that way. And yeah, I always knew that like making a game was something that I wanted to do, but I don't think at any point in the past I've really had an idea that I wanted to explore to that full of an extent, or also the skills to do so, right? So theoretically, both of those things have changed now.
It sounds like you've spent a good amount of time sort of dedicating yourself to history, because I saw that you wrote 2 books. And that you also...
Yeah, well, one of them is a real, like, history book. The other one's more of, like, creative, but...
Oh, I see. Okay. And I want to touch on those in just a second. But the other thing besides the books was or is the podcast. Is it still currently running?
Yeah, I last did an episode, I guess I released it, like, a few days before the new year. And that was, like, in progress since June, and the final episode ended up being like 5.5 hours long.
Holy shit.
Just like the most dense fucking history. Am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Oh, absolutely, please, yeah.
The most dense fucking history like I ever dealt with. And so I'm taking a little bit of a break before I get back into doing that. I'm thinking maybe like sometime during the summer.
So you had those books, which are maybe are they at least both sort of like socio-politically, sort of historically like focused? That's kind of their focus?
The first book, which is this kind of like collection of poetry is about American culture in like a macro sense.
Okay.
The second book is called Structural Politics, is kind of an examination of the politics of the built form and how ideals influence architecture, how buildings can change and mold the way we feel and act in conscious and unconscious ways, and how that can be manipulated. What I think is some pretty interesting stuff, and it like plays into the notion that of course everything is political, right? So that's like the larger idea it's trying to thrust at.
I don't get the chance to talk about sort of game design through many other lenses with people, especially because like I feel like a lot of people I've talked to either come from the arts with like a huge focus on the arts, and like I mean that's where I come from. I'm sure you have some part of you is probably involved in all that, but like the fact that you did have this other huge focus, you do have this other huge focus, and that it's painted your game design with that is very fascinating to me. Because the other thing I want to ask you about, let me just kind of make sure I'm looking at the right thing here. The actual plot of the game is based off of like sort of an alternate history telling, off of something sort of like really kind of niche little, maybe a lot of people don't really know about. I mean, I didn't even really know about some coup that was in there.
This 5.5 hour episode of my history podcast I did about this thing.
Oh, perfect.
So I felt,
can you give me the nutshell of that?
So it's the key character is this guy named Smedley Butler, who is rises to be a major general in the Marine Corps, has a 33-year-long career in the Marines, wins the Medal of Honor twice to this day, is one of the most decorated Marines in Corps history. And his career, he joins the Marines in 1898 and the start of the Spanish-American War. His career essentially mirrors the rise and growth of the American Empire. And over the next 33 years, he is deployed internationally, I believe, don't quote me on the exact number, but north of like 16 times. And all these myriad reasons for his deployments, like, he goes to Haiti, where he creates this kind of militarized police force that ends up dissolving the democratic government. He goes to Nicaragua, where he reinforces land claims for American banana growers and helps do coups to, overthrow the nascent liberal government there. And this is the story that is repeated in every single country in this very, very long tale. There comes a point when he realizes that he is being used as a tool of these powerful political and capital interests, to do the bidding of these powerful companies. And it, fills him with this very bitter resentment that causes him to turn, at the end of his career, away from imperialism and capitalism and like his belief in kind of the goodness of the American government. And that brings us to 1934. He's approached by these two fellows from the American Legion who essentially, to make a long story short, wrote him into this plot to lead essentially an American version of Mussolini's March on Rome, with 500,000 disaffected veterans to unseat FDR and replace him with a Secretary of General Affairs who is going to, institute forced labor policies and, all sorts of awful policies that are essentially taken directly from the fascist book in Europe. And Butler, because he's had this change of heart over the course of his career, instead of going along with it, he blows the whistle, and it starts this whole Senate investigation. The House of Representatives comes in and holds a hearing in the McCormick-Dickstein Committee that eventually corroborates every single fact of his claim and says, like, yes, there's this quote, the fascist conspiracy to overthrow the government was proved, right? And the entire thing is essentially completely covered up and forgotten from American history. Not a lot of people know today what Smedley Butler or who Smedley Butler was and what he did.
Right. That is insane. Quite the starting point to be like, oh, let's tell an alternate history story with that.
Yeah. Well, it feels like a very ripe opportunity.
Totally.
Right.
It sounded like you were saying, tell me if this is wrong, but more about sort of using the real history as a context and sort of something to paint the world that the player can sort of just discover themselves.
Yeah. So it's it's informed in history in that it's very much a mirror. So, for example, there are a lot of things that are done by, the bad guy faction in this game that are essentially, analogous events that are taken from, real events in American history. And they're very much the same with characters. Some people, the people that you interact with individually aren't real, but they interact with real people, and there are definitely real people, like President Nixon. What's he doing in 1972 in this universe? Oh, he's running for his 4th consecutive term, right? And so there are a lot of interesting and fun ways that the real history intersects with kind of this parallel universe that I'm trying to create.
So that's the history of it. That's the context of what's happening in the world. Now, the other thing that's really awesome too is that your design sensibilities, as far as like cosmetic design sensibilities, the architecture. I haven't seen any people in it yet, but I've seen products.
I haven't started working on the human models yet. Those are coming down the pipe.
Right. Really quick, before I get too into this architecture stuff right now, what is, do you have any idea of how you're going to address humans, people in the game, as far as model and style and stuff?
Stylistically, I'm not quite sure yet. I know what their outfits are going to look like. Essentially everything about them except for, what's the face going to look like. it's a difficult choice because you can see in the stuff that I've been putting out, I'm going for a decently realistic art style, but I wouldn't call it photoreal, right? It's kind of like I don't know if this is a snobby to assign myself a label, but like an impressionistic realism, right?
Right.
Like the geometry is not necessarily that of what the real item is, but it's kind of like what you think it is in your mind's eye.
Right.
And so, like, I don't know if it would be jarring to have something, say, like, I'm using Unreal Engine. I don't know if it would be jarring to use an Unreal MetaHuman or something to use in a human model, because that is something that's photoreal. So we'll see.
Right, because every time I look at those, I'm like, I don't like how's he gonna do people? You're talking about like the film influences. You're talking about like 1989 Batman. You're talking about Brazil. What were some of the other ones? Like you said, like Hudsucker Proxy and Dark City. Right.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like where your heart lies with those films and kind of their impression on you?
Well, I think it's like, the common thread through all of those films is kind of dark, grimy, almost faceless Gothic metropolises with a lot of neon. And, I think that's a pretty fairly reflected in the stuff that I've been doing. I don't know if you could describe it necessarily as Gothic. I'd probably skewer more in the Art Deco mid-century direction. But like, there's this great description of, I can't remember who was the practical effects artist on the 89 Batman movie, but he's like describing the way they designed Gotham as, if hell shot out of the pavement and kept on growing. And I always thought that was like a great way to describe a grimy, awful, rat-infested city, right?
Right.
And so that's kind of like the energy that I'm trying to bring into organizing these spaces.
Right. It's coming through. Yeah, that is definitely coming through. Because it inspires such feelings of discomfort looking at the screen grabs of the world, but at the same time, like really beautiful too. Like the neon does something. It's like you could take something really sort of like perverted and make it confusingly
put some neon on there and it's classed up.
Right. I especially enjoyed seeing like you had like a sex shop that said like something like pleasures great and small or something like that.
I forget quite what that sign says, but yeah, something like that.
Are you when you're designing these things, it's you writing those, are you making the copy? Are you doing 100% of the things? So good. I kind of want to talk about like, so when you're making these things, I have a lot of questions for people who are trying to build their own whole worlds, because, like I'm doing it and I never know when I'm getting carried away with details, and I never know when I'm getting sidetracked or being irresponsible, and sort of like where to balance like the producer in me versus the artist in me. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about sort of your production process in relation to, specifically, just so we can kind of like focus on something here, is how you divvy up your time between like researching and just references and I gotta find the perfect thing, because you're sort of, as fictional as your place is, I know how focused you are also on modeling it after something that does exist. So if you could talk a little about that.
So I have like this massive repository of reference images on my Google Drive that's like subdivided into, what are the objects you can put in your inventory, what are the machines, each level has its own varying folder with subdirectories. And so like anytime in any context I see something out in the world, it's like, oh, that's going in the reference folder.
Right.
And then in terms of, how I pull out of there into actually producing something, I'm probably like not the best source for a like really hard-nosed, you shouldn't go and indulge on a lot of detail, because I absolutely love just putting a really kind of excessive amount of detail or little flourishes onto something. Like because I think a lot of the joy in development for me is like you can essentially do magic, right? Like, and I think there's a lot of satisfaction in kind of pulling off a visual effect in a way that's kind of tricky, right? So like I know you saw this because you responded to it, but for the benefit of those who might not have seen it, I made this record machine the other day, and it's based on like a 1962 AMI Continental 2. So like I'm working from a real record machine, and as the motion works, it has this circular record wheel in the back, and so you shuffle through the wheel, and then a shuttle arm comes, picks the record out, and lays it down on the turntable. And so like if you were accomplishing that effect genuinely, right, like it's the same record that's in the rack, in the shuttle arm, or on the turntable, that would be really fucking hard to do, right? But you can accomplish that exact same effect by having 3 persistent records at the exact same time that just flip out of visibility whenever you need them. And so it's just like finding fun stuff to do like that.
I love that so much. Yeah, and so it is good to know that you do enjoy indulging in those things and like, but are still sort of in the background using clever trickery to sort of like just sell the part that's most important to you, that you find most fascinating.
Yeah, it's like I think you can a good trick. I don't know if I'm experienced enough to be like doling out tricks yet.
Please.
But something that I have found that works for me is like if you want to accomplish something really complex, you can. Most likely you can break it down into a larger number of very simple steps, and accomplishing each one of those steps is going to be much, much easier than trying to tackle the whole thing, and it makes it easier to debug your code, so there's that too.
Would you mind indulging me, you don't have to if you don't want to, with the folder names, the hierarchy of that database that you were talking about?
Okay. Yeah. So this entire folder that I'm about to show you will be good to go. So like here are all like a subdivision of things that are in the world. So world items is a lot of like posters, paper ephemera. This is eventually going to be turned into a scale model that's going to sit on someone's office desk. And inside of here, like we have machines subdivided into like I'm working on a computer that's going to be a big pain in the ass because I got to work out how to do the widgets. You notice like I did a recreation of this shoe shine machine you can see in some of my screenshots.
Is that like you would insert a coin in the middle right there?
Yeah, and so I haven't implemented the function for that specific machine yet, but how it's going to work is like all of the machines that you've seen me post on Twitter are essentially fancy guard distractors. And so the shoe shine machine, you're going to put a coin in and it's going to bang around and make some noise, right?
Right. That's my favorite Warner Brothers logo, by the way. Out of all the ones that they've gone through, the 3 lines is the best. Yeah. So how often are you trying to get like, you find something specifically and you try to like go for the 1-to-1?
It depends, because for a machine, I can be like, I want this exact machine, which is very similar to what I did when I reproduced a Scopatone machine, which is an old French vending machine from the 60s that like sells music videos. I want the features of this model, but I want to extend it in this way. That happens a lot with architecture. I'll want a building, but in order to fit in the spot it needs to on the map, it'll need to be wider or maybe be a weird shape or what have you. Right. I try to do essentially like a 1-to-1 reproduction whenever I can.
Same.
But stylistically and mechanically, I'll make exceptions.
I think jukeboxes are they're not there yet. I think they're going to be the next video game toilets. Whereas same thing in the 90s, it was like, okay, you got to put a toilet in your game, and does it flush, And I think we're going to start seeing like now with the sort of like accessibility and like just anybody being able to try to throw their hat in the ring for this kind of thing. I personally just want to see more people taking a crack at jukeboxes. Do you plan on adding any sort of like additional layers of interactivity to the jukebox?
I have thought. Well, it's difficult to like speak to how the jukebox is going to end up because I think its final incarnation largely depends on if I will be able to use any licensed music. And like I have a number of tracks in mind that are like very intentionally not stuff that is popular and also stuff that is old. So theoretically, it should be available to use. But
Right.
ideally, I'd like the jukebox to be, maybe you have 5 or 6 songs preloaded into that, and then it plays one randomly, non-repeating, and you sprinkle a few of those throughout the game, and maybe over the course of a playthrough, someone hears all 6.
Right.
Something to that extent.
What is your plan with the music stuff? Like, are you thinking about raising money for like buying rights to music? Are you thinking about even making your own? Like, where?
I'm planning on working with 2 guys I know, 2 of my friends who are like very experienced in musical composition and scoring to do some original tracks for the game. I think it's not going to have a soundtrack in a traditional sense of like music that plays while you're playing the game,
Right.
but music will be inserted diegetically, which is one of the reasons why I've kind of have this desire to use historical licensed tracks, because in the scenario where you're hearing music in the game, it's going to be, oh, you went over and turned on a radio to distract a guard, or maybe you turned on the radio, picked up and threw it across the room to send him somewhere else, or you're hearing it on a jukebox or something like that.
Right.
And with that kind of era that I'm going for, 1972, I feel like that is such a musically strong era. That's
Of course,
around
yeah.
the time of stuff that I myself enjoy listening to, and so to be able to incorporate some of that would be a real treat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat where it's like I really, I would love to. I think when it comes down to like, I'm not gonna be able to afford it. Like
Yeah.
I think it's very like I have like sort of dream goals where I told myself like if the game ever sells enough copies, I would happily go into the break even area of profits just to put the money back into licensed music or stuff like that. James Bond and other fictional spy influence, because like off the top of my head I would have to say like, oh, this game doesn't really seem to have any particular like influence from James Bond, like a really sort of like campy schlocky sort of thing. The game does have a camp to it. It seems so far.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, is there any other influence other than James Bond?
I'm not a huge Bond fan, but I've always loved, the classic evil villain lair, rocket inside a volcano, and that is the kind of energy that I'm trying to bring to the design of spaces. This, Ken Adam, I think, was the set designer for those early Connery Bonds, and I've got plenty of Ken Adam set design pictures in my reference folder. Yeah, like those 60s spy shows, Get Smart. I did this system where if you play a game of pool and sink all of the balls, you can unlock a secret door. Like that's something from an episode of Get Smart.
Good. That's so good.
The Prisoner, which is this show from 1968, starring something I can't remember his name, but it's a very good show.
Okay.
And it's like kind of psychedelic too, which is a really cool to see, like a late 60s incarnation of kind of this clean cut super spy trope. Yeah, like Man from U.N.C.L.E. The player or the character you play as is number 6, and
Right.
that is his number, of course, because he has to be one better than 007.
Right.
Which I think is probably like the only kind of Bond reference I think I overtly have.
Jean Le Carre.
Yeah, he's a spy that came in from the cold and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Because I don't know how campy his stuff is. I always thought his was a little bit more straight faced, a little bit more like.
Yeah, he as an author is pretty hard boiled, but the TV show Man from U.N.C.L.E. Has maybe marginally less camp than some of the other shows at the time, but
Sure.
it's still a little goofy.
Right. Yeah, you'd have to imagine so that like adaptations of that kind of stuff. Like the fact that you are in the immersive sim genre. Well, first of all, when did you hear that term? Like how long have you known about that term?
I don't know if I could give you like a specific date, but a decent number of years, probably like more than 6 or 7 years.
That's fucking crazy.
But it's, there's ever expansive debate about how appropriate it is as a term. So
Right. What are the simmiest parts of your design? Like what are sort of like the most open-ended aspects of your design?
I would say, in general, I'm just designing in a way that attempts to give the player as many options in terms of, traversal, but also enemies, that comes in the form of a number of suite of tools in, lethal and non-lethal formats. I watched this great GDC talk a number of years ago. I can't remember the name of who gave it, but it was one of the developers at IO Interactive talking about how they build the maps for the new Hitman games. And they talk about how they do, these are complex maps, and they talk about how they design in circles so that the player always has a way to move forward and will always naturally progress through the course of the map in kind of like a complex loop. Designing a new area, I make one of the Hitman circles, I connect some paths across it, see where those new paths might connect to, and like slowly weed out a really complex way that you can interact with a space.
When you're designing these maps and you said you draw the circles, are you like pen and paper drawing your maps first, like a top-down sort of view?
No, not really. I've only done that once, and it's not for this level that I'm currently working on. Mostly I just I start out with a rough white box and then kind of obsessively plan things in my head and go back and forth comparing my reference photos, seeing like, all right, what's going to fit where? And then I just kind of start whittling away at making various versions of the models.
Are there any things mechanically that you've run into where it's like you're really sort of in there with the the machete chopping down leaves, like trailblazing, like you're like there's no information about how to do this type of thing I want to do? Like have you found yourself in that position yet?
I don't know if there are necessarily any areas where I'm like carving the path forward, but there are definitely some areas where I may be at a bit of a technical roadblock. For example, I'm working in Unreal Engine, and I need to use in order to create these complex levels where you can say, load into the inside of a building that has a loading screen, you need to use a persistent level structure. Unreal Engine has a culling optimization feature called world partition that can really have a positive impact on performance. Currently, the world partition system is not compatible with the persistent level structure, and so like figuring out, okay, how am I going to make that work? I don't know if I would call myself maybe a trailblazer for having that problem, but maybe if I can figure it out, I'll be clever.
Right. I mean, I think that's something that's like really helpful to kind of put out there is like just when somebody sees this thing that you're making, they're going like, this looks fantastic, especially like, younger people like kids and stuff who might be like going like, if one person can make this kind of thing. And especially for genres that are maybe unexplored and stuff, just knowing that it's like, hey, we run into shit that we're kind of probably banging our head against the wall for a while too. And sometimes we just straight up fail. It's like, I just can't do some things.
Yeah, I mean, there have been like a number of times when I've been working on something and it has, become apparent to me that like, with the level of skill that I had at that time, I could not complete that specific set of code, and I needed to come back and revisit it later. And being able to then come back and take a look at that thing that really stumped you, 3 months ago, and saying like, oh, this is so easy. Like that's a great feeling, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's just go through this list really quick, and you could just tell me if you've played these. Have you played Gravity Bone, 30 Flights of Loving, Quadrilateral Cowboy, Papers, Please, or Jazz Punk?
Played jazz punk, and I absolutely love it. Like, big influence on the game. Haven't played any of the others. Quadrilateral Cowboy is on my Steam wishlist though, so I'll get around to playing it one day. But yeah, I absolutely love jazz punk. I remade one of the props from it.
Right, yes, I did see that one. Yeah.
Yeah, that really really cool game. I'm really a big fan of it.
The sort of like subgenre of these 60s to 70s ish, or maybe even 50s to 70s ish, like just the
dark mid-century.
it's like I could eat it up. It's like it's one of those things that is like it's sort of far and few, to be fair. Like there's like a few. I feel like a lot of AAA studios have done the 50s thing. You know,
yeah, like the chrome kind of contented but dark secret housewife.
Exactly.
That's kind of been troped out.
Yeah, exactly. So it's nice seeing it get a little bit more sort of nuanced into like narrowing in on like different types of or different parts.
Grain.
Say what?
Give me some wood grain.
Oh yeah, yes. Oh, absolutely. That's why you have to. Okay, so you should like Quadrilateral Cowboys on your list. You should totally get that. But before that, for just short bite-sized experiences that'll take you all of less than an hour to finish, play Gravity Bone and 30 Flights of Loving. Have you heard of those games?
I've heard of 30 Flights of Loving, yes, but not Gravity Bone.
Those ones are really short. I think Gravity Bone is like maybe 10 minutes, and then 30 Flights of Loving I think is like it's less than half an hour. And the thing about those games is that they are super linear, totally handcrafted experiences. So it's like, you know, you're being told a story, but like, oh man, like cosmetically and sort of like just the visuals and audio, everything about it. It's one of the few games that touches on a cosmetic that I've seen in film, seen in comic books and sort of art and stuff. But being in that world, it's like, those are like the best examples. So anyways, yeah, you should go play those. You said that you were going to make it so that when you're navigating the world, you are looking at street signs. You are looking for sort of like actual physical diegetic cues because there is no HUD, there's no UI, GPS system that's taking you to the location. That being said, are there any other things in the game that you are designing with sort of like a strict diegetic design philosophy that you're kind of like that maybe you don't see in other games too?
Well, ideally, like I want essentially everything besides contextual interaction UI to be diegetic.
Fuck yeah.
I'm going to be working on light gym systems similar to Thief. My plan for that is, you know, you'll have a wristwatch that has little lights on it that will give you your light indicator. I don't know how I'm going to do sound yet, maybe with a different colored set of lights on the bottom of the face, but yeah, essentially like everything that can be done diegetically will be, and trying to work on a diegetic computer now. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's going to be a pain in the ass.
I have no idea what you mean by a diegetic computer. Can you?
Like, did you play the Shadows of Doubt Next Fest demo?
I haven't. I've seen some gameplay of it though.
How computers work in Shadows of Doubt is, you go and you interact with the computer, and it like lerps your screen down, so it's like you're actually in world interacting with the computer, and like instead of your movement controls now affect a cursor on the screen, and you can click on buttons, kind of like how screens worked in Prey 2017 as well. But with those, like, you can move around and work in a fixed position. So like figuring out how to do that's going to be a task.
I think this is maybe why you'll have some fun with Quadrilateral Cowboy, because it is the same thing.
Yeah, I've seen like the techno computer aesthetics from their Steam page. Yeah.
Yeah. You said you did a lot of upfront work, or you spent a lot of time designing systems that will hopefully save you time later. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like what those systems were, kind of what the hurdles are, and kind of what you hope the payoffs to kind of be like, and get as dry and as nerdy and as rambly as you want.
I came up with a ridiculously, or it's probably not ridiculously complex, but maybe irritatingly complex for me set of code that runs like an elevator that you can dynamically go between any number of floors.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things where I started to work on it and I realized like I am not skilled enough to make this, and I had to come back months later. And eventually, like when I made this fucking elevator, I can now use that elevator code to do any number of elevators in any styles, which makes it much, much faster and easier to create vertical level spaces. Like, I made this big atrium that is essentially like a condensed version of the Bradbury Building atrium, I guess a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think I did see something like that. That's wild.
Yeah, well, and that started out as like conceptually, I was like, I want to put an elevator here. What can I build around it? And like, I already had the elevator, so like the rest of the space came around it in just 2 or 3 days.
Right.
And so stuff like that. Now that I have a pool table that you can play for all of the maybe 4 contexts in the rest of the game where you'll need a pool table, I don't have to make one again, right?
Right. Templatizing things.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I have a big old hard-on for templatizing things. It's really funny hearing you tell the elevator story too, because I'm at the halfway point of your story personally. Like a year ago, I designed a template for elevators to work, and I stopped at the point where I realized like it could take you to any floor, and I was like, cool, I could copy and paste this on all my elevators, and it worked. But the only problem was that like I realized that it created a queue of floors to hit in the order that they were called in, and that drove me insane because it made me realize at that point that everything I had designed around that was going to make it hard for me to make it so that it would respect the order, but only after respecting the nearest one.
Yeah, like the logic of the so like I
like because you don't want it to go all the way down to like if you're at 10, you don't want it to go to 1 if somebody called it at 7 just because 1 called it first. And I was like, fuck, and I just like, and I had to like I was like, came so close, but again it was one of those things where I was like, I think I'm at the halfway point of your story where I think maybe in the next few weeks or so I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna knock that logic out. And it's like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
So,
are you in Unity?
I am. I'm in Unity.
I've heard moving platforms are very difficult in Unity for some reason.
It is a pain in the ass. I finally found a solution that is a catch-all. It works, and as far as I'm concerned, it's behind me now. But yeah, that was a thing in the beginning, which is annoying. But yeah, as far as like working in Unity goes, because like my analog, I think you've seen Lewis, he also uses PlayMaker. I use PlayMaker. So it's kind of like, it's basically blueprints. It's like, it could go high level or low level, but I know in the end we're both doing nodes and like making little templates that we could reuse places.
God, I love nodes.
Oh yeah, just, yeah. I like to kind of go into not so game devy bits, but sort of the more like the little kid in you who played video games and like, maybe there's the weird familial issues that make you play some games more than other, or something like that. Yeah, so the first thing I would want to hear is like, what kind of games did you play growing up, and did you, or like?
Well, growing up, I did not really play any games at all. I grew up on a farm in the middle of very rural Pennsylvania, and my parents were very adamant that, you were going to spend your time playing outside. We had a very slow, CRT workstation, and you had, 1 hour of screen time a day. And despite it all, I still developed a love for the design of video games.
Oh, it's irresistible.
Yeah.
But that is kind of a crazy, like, contrast. Do you think that that's like influenced any sort of your like work habits or like?
I think it's definitely influenced the type of games that I'm interested in making. Like, I think one of the reasons that you see PSX nostalgia really popular right now is because like the people that played those games growing up are now old enough to make games of their own, and like that's what they're nostalgic for.
Right.
I never had any experiences with those consoles. You know, my first real foray into video games was the first BioShock.
Interesting.
And so, like, you know, I don't have any nostalgia for GoldenEye or, you know, Mario 64 or any of those really older generations of games because I relatively was a latecomer.
That is a really crazy concept. And I do forget, like, yeah, you're 25. That does put you on the timeline to be, like, ready for it's like, my first game was BioShock, which is a crazy thing. And I know maybe it's not necessarily technically your first game, right? I imagine it's just...
I played like the I Spy, you know, hidden picture games and stuff like that. But, you know, I wouldn't call myself a serious gamer.
Right. At this point in our conversation, my internet turned to dog shit and stayed that way for hours every day for a few days. So I asked Alice to answer the last questions via recorded message. So I asked, what games have you played in adulthood? Because we talked about childhood games. And then I asked, has a game ever made you cry?
Okay, games I played as an adult. I went back and like discovered the old games from the 2000s that I missed. So like the original Deus Ex, Thief 2, Thief 3, but I didn't really like the new Thief reboot. Dishonored, the Dishonored series, of course. Really, any of the Arcane stuff. This is maybe like embarrassing to admit, but I actually cried to a game earlier this afternoon playing Cyberpunk 2077. And probably like the end of Red Dead Redemption 2 made me cry. But normally I don't, you know, like I've never played Celeste or anything like that. I hear that's a real tearjerker. But yeah, I think that is just about it.